Italian sculptor Dionisio Cimarelli has traversed the world, studying and perfecting his craft, to ultimately be recognized internationally. He now resides in the United States, where he teaches at the famed Art Students League in New York City. Let's join him in the classroom. Dionisio, thank you so much for joining us on ITALICS.
Thank you to you.
So you're originally from Le Marche, but you've lived all over the world, from Eastern Europe, obviously you were born there, Paris, Asia, and now you're back in the States. What has your experience been, and what have you learned in your vast travels and living abroad?
Traveling for me is very important because you learn a lot. You learn about culture, you learn about people, you learn the behaving of the people. That's all this for me is kind of information to transfer to my work. So that's very, very important. You learn a lot of things, and when you meet the people, that is extremely important for your work, especially as an artist. I started to travel since I was a little young man. I was 18 years old. I was a student. So 20 years old, I went to China by myself for more than a year, traveling around Asia. So all these are very kind of, it's like a petrol for me, you know, it's like in a candle, the oxygen is very, very important. It's fundamental. That's why I try to put together the traveling and my business, my work. And so I've been traveling all my life, and I was working as a restaurator around Europe. So like in France, like in Denmark, like in Sweden, like in Helsinki. So all this, I think, is enrich yourself. And I try to take all this information, what you learn from this culture. Always you learn something very important from the humanity of the world culture.
You spent a period of time restoring around Europe. For example, at the Cour Napoleon du Louvre.
This restoration was one of the biggest restorations ever done in the 1900s. So I participated for 2 years. So it was for me fantastic work directly on the wall of the building, the Louvre Museum. So it was an amazing experience for me, and especially also for changing the way of thinking in sculpture. So before I was an abstract sculptor, and thanks to the Louvre, I changed and I started to work with the figurative.
Usually artists will start from figurative and then progress to abstract, but you did kind of the reverse. What sparked this? What made you change?
Well, that's what I mentioned. I mean, before I started with abstract, because in the school, when I studied during the 80s, it was very common, everybody work with abstract.
In Italy or everywhere?
In Italy. I was studied at the Carrara Academy in Tuscany. So even it was very traditional, but still was very much concentrated on abstract. Very few people that were working with figurative.
And directly to abstract? Not with the base of, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's, now, I mean, they thought, after the Second World War, less and less people, they start to work with the figurative, even in Italy, unfortunately, in a way, because it's a very important to start as a solid base of knowledge. I think it's a fundamental for me. But anyway, I was working for nearly 10 years with abstract, which it was very interesting too. But obviously, if you work with figurative, you see the sculpture with a different eye, because the figurative gives to you a big knowledge on many, many different things for the shaping and the forms of the sculptures, and not only, also the drawing or anything. So it's very important to start with the figurative, as I'm telling to all my students always.
That's interesting because when I studied clay sculpture here, my instructor said exactly what you're saying now. You need a solid base, not only in your armature to hold up your sculpture,
Absolutely.
but also in your studies. And they said, well, Jackson Pollock. And he said, well, have you seen Jackson Pollock's figurative drawings ever?
Or Picasso, or Henry Moore, Miro, everybody, they start with the figurative, and after they jump and change, there is an evolution, and you go to the abstract, or you change your figurative way of working. So I think the figurative, the study, the classic, I think is a very important base. That doesn't mean you have to continue as a figurative artist, but still gives to you a very, very strong, solid base.
Speaking of, I guess, strange things, people think it's strange an Italian in China, but for centuries there have been Chinese people in Italy and centuries of Italians in China. What do you think lends to this kind of thinking?
Well, I think it's the relationship between China and Italy since Marco Polo. I mean, we are talking about the Middle Age. Always there was a very strong feeling between these two old culture and countries. And so I think probably Marco Polo was the first one, and the second, very well known, very important, was Matteo Ricci in the 1600. And I think always between Chinese and Italian, we have many things in common. Even we are so far away as a countries, but in some way, I mean, I learned when I went there and as I lived there, we have so many things in common.
What are the commonalities?
The common things is like the family, or the thinking, or the way of doing business, and the food. Even the food is different, but we have a certain way of approaching the food. So, I mean, even as I said, we are so far as a country, but we are so close. So in a way, I say always to the foreigners that probably Italian, they are the people which they are getting closer to the Chinese culture much faster and quicker than any other country and other people.
And do you think Italians in Italy are becoming closer to Chinese and Chinese Italians? I mean, I remember being in Calabria and being in like a little bodega and seeing Chinese, kids, like teens of Chinese descent who were speaking, Regino dialect. Sure. Do you think, I think with their generation probably, but do you think that older Italians are starting to kind of, let's say, accept other cultures and Chinese people into the...
I think now the Italian, this is a kind of an issue of today, because more and more foreigners, they are approaching Italy as being an important country economically speaking in Europe. And so this is kind of big discussion. Of course, now is a lot of Chinese, they move to Italy for business. And so I think some of them, absolutely. I met some young Chinese, they speak dialect, Rome dialect or Milan dialect, and I was impressed about that. It's funny because after I've been living in China and to meet these Chinese, they were speaking Italian dialect. It's kind of really impressive. And yes, of course, but now there are two parts of Chinese. A part of Chinese, a big part of Chinese, they go there for just making business. And, maybe they left from the countryside, and it happened also many decades ago. But now there are a new generation of Chinese with a very more sophisticated, more educated, which they are coming with a different way, not looking for job, but looking for making a business at a high level. So we are talking about culture, we are talking about art, we are talking about industrial or finance, all this. And this is probably is a thing which it started in the last 10 years. Before it was mostly the Chinese that were coming from the countryside, and they left and were looking for just a basic, simple job.
You mentioned Matteo Ricci, and one of your major works that you created in China was a statue on the occasion of the Italy Pavilion for the Expo 2010 in Shanghai. How did that come about that you were asked to do this project, and why Ricci?
Well, for a few different reasons. 2010, it was the World Expo in Shanghai. 2010 was the anniversary of Matteo Ricci. And plus 2010, it was 6 years I was in China, and in some way I was pretty well known and people, they knew my name. So we started to discuss with the Italian government and the responsible people from the pavilion. They asked me if I was interested in making this sculpture, because beside that, I mean, very important, I mean, Matteo Ricci is from Le Marche, like me, he's a Marchigiano. For me, asking me to make this big sculpture of Matteo Ricci for this important event, which was the World Expo, and at the same time, the anniversary of him, it was a great honor. It was fantastic, because before going to China, always I knew Ricci, what he did in China.
Was this something that's taught in Italian in schools?
Unfortunately not. That's always I'm complaining in Italy, because Matteo Ricci is not known enough. But in China, everybody knows Matteo Ricci with a different name, which is Limato. Is not. So if you say, you ask about Matteo Ricci, they don't know.
It had a huge impact, right? I mean, there's so many levels to what he did in China. Can you tell us a little bit about his history?
Matteo Ricci, he was fundamentally, he was just a Jesuit. So the Pope sent him to China for open the Christianity to China. But Matteo Ricci was a completely different person. He did not go to China and tell to Chinese, we have a better culture, a better religion, we teach you. But he started to go to China with a different approach. So he went to China as study and learning from Chinese. So it was an exchange of friendship, which Chinese, they really appreciate that. So I think this kind of approach is still very contemporary. It could be, we could use it even today. So at the same time, he was a scientist. So he did plenty of things. He brought the watch, and he did the first Chinese map. He was a cartographer. So he was an incredible person, and he started the pinyin, which we are still using after 400 years. The translation of the Chinese character in Latin letters. So he was an incredible person. And so they still, Chinese today, in the Chinese culture, they see him as an important person. They really have a big respect. By the way, he was the first foreigners buried officially in China, in Beijing. He's still there.
Wow. And I also read that even Mao, despite the religious aspects of Ricci's work, his, was it, I don't know if it was his grave or something, he was still, even Mao upheld him for his scientific contributions to China.
Absolutely. That's everybody respect. He got a big respect in China. That's why my sculpture, in a way, he get a big visibility in China, and people, because there are no sculpture about Matteo Ricci in China, very, very few. So this work, it was very different from the few others, and in some way, I had the Chinese show big interest. So still today, the original in plaster is just in front of the Italian consulate in Shanghai.
Fantastic. And there's something interesting that you included on this sculpture. Can you tell us what that is?
What is that? What do you mean?
I guess I'll say it. There are Chinese characters all over this sculpture.
Well, it was a kind of my thinking, and I thought in a modern way, and I thought, I like calligraphy, and I think it's a great culture. I've been very interested about calligraphy, but obviously I'm not a sinologue, so I start to writing some characters, so I tried to put this calligraphy on my sculpture, which I thought it's part of the beauty. And so I translated this character with my name. And so it was like a logo on a more contemporary on the sculptures.
That's a very interesting merging of, let's say, historical and contemporary. Very interesting. And these characters also appear on one of the series of your babies, your porcelain babies.
Yes, because it was my period in China, which I've been doing porcelain. So I wanted to find a new material in China which represent the Chinese culture. And before I never worked with the porcelain. I did with ceramic, but it's pretty different, even I didn't know before. So after a few years I was there, I thought I want to find a material which represents the Chinese culture. And what is better than porcelain? So I went to Jindajian and I opened my own studio. Jindajian is the most important place for the most famous porcelain in China, which is a 1 hour fly from Shanghai. It's since the Tang Dynasty they make a fantastic porcelain. So I started to learn all this traditional technique, which it was much more difficult than what I thought, and it was very, very challenging. So I made a series of porcelain, which it was a child, and the head of child and mask. So it was all the series which I tried to, every one of them are just a unique edition. They are different, all of them. And obviously I include some of them, not all, this character and the calligraphy, which it was part of this period of several years in China.
And tell us more about the babies, because the babies have something particular about them that actually is what led you to experimenting or to need to experiment a lot with the porcelain process.
Yes, that's I didn't know, because as I said, I was before working with the ceramic, and the ceramic is different. So I thought to make it a child, this baby in porcelain, I thought probably would be the same. I would have the same problem, the same difficulties, but I was wrong. So in fact, when I was looking for some helping, assistance from Jindajian, and Chinese, they didn't want to help me. And they said, why? Because they were scary. They said, this is too complicated. It's not the normal shape for making in porcelain.
Wow.
But I like challenge, so I didn't give up. And I said, that's not the problem. Let's go forward and try. In fact, it was extremely complicated, much more than what I ever expected. So, because the porcelain, when it's fired at a very high temperature, so it becomes like a gelatin in the sculpture. So this cannot stand. So I created all my special way of keep it standing this child in the kiln for firing. And several of the sculpture, they were destroyed, broken, because so it was very, very complicated because they couldn't stand, during the firing.
Wow.
So it was a very big problem.
Wow. And the babies are not only standing, but they're standing on one foot.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So on the other side this is only 1 foot, and so on the other, and plus there are 2 pieces with the base. So you need to create a special system and inside to put together with the base still in porcelain. Anyway, it was very challenging. Wow. By the end, I managed, and I think it was an interesting result.
Wow. One of the projects that you participated in was the construction of luxury villas. How does a sculptor bring his art to architecture?
Well, it was also a very interesting project for me, because it was a very, very large project, 81 luxury villas outside of Shanghai. All the designers were American. One of them is the former dean of the Harvard University. So it was a very high level, and they approached me. They asked me to get in this project, which for me in the beginning I was kind of a little bit titulant, because I'm not an architect. But it was very interesting because they want to use my knowledge as a restorator, as an artist, as a contemporary artist, as a sculptor, to use for the construction of these villas, which they use some material like stone, wood,
not even porcelain.
Not porcelain.
That would have been a challenge.
But some stone, they use even the same stone I used in the Louvre Museum. Wow. They use in some villas. So it was the president, he had this idea to get me in this project as an art director, And it was a wonderful, amazing, incredible, really experience. It was really fantastic. So I have been working with them for nearly 6 years for this project.
Now you're here in New York teaching here at the Art Students League. As a teacher, as a mentor, how do you recognize something in a student?
To recognize the talent on people is always very difficult because everybody, every student has his own talent expressed in a different way. So to recognize that is always very hard.
What does the future have in store for you? Any new mediums you want to try?
Well, now I moved here to New York and I got a very different inspiration by the city because the city is completely different from China or from California where I was living before. So I'm thinking, and yes, and at the same time I've been trying so many different media already, and I'm thinking about that and try to put together all this information at the same time, try to find out what's the city inspired me, and what is all the people around me and the school and all this my experience. So it's in my mind, I'm working on it.
You also have, there's an exhibit coming up of your students' work.
That will be next month, starting May 9th. Will be upstairs at the gallery.
Great. Here at the Art Students League. Great. Thank you so much for inviting us here and talking about your work.
My big pleasure. Thank you.